This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. Today we are joined by Scott Rank of the History Unplugged podcast to discuss the 2005 movie Kingdom of Heaven, starring Orlando Bloom, Edward Norton, and many others. Kingdom of Heaven was directed by Ridley Scott, who brought us such great historically based movies like Gladiator. He also produced and/or directed Exodus, Gods and Kings, and Robin Hood, movies which we have discussed previously on Beyond the Big Screen. Today, we're not going to spend a lot of time picking through the accuracies and inaccuracies of this film, but instead look at some broad themes the movie brought up and look if these themes were applicable at the time. Scott, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your podcast?
Yeah, sure. My podcast is called History Unplugged, historyunpluggedpodcast.com. I try to aim for both breadth and depth in analyzing history. So once a week, I'll speak with a guest and have a long form episode, talk to a book author, talk to historical consultant for movies. And then the other days of the week, I take questions from the audience and answer any question they have. The thing that I try to do is understand history as a foreign country, that you don't have to get too many decades into the past where humans are dealing with the same universal issues we all deal with: love, death, war, taxes. But the values can sometimes be startling. Now, the lazy way to look at that is to think, wow, people thought about things differently in the past. They were stupid. Why were they so stupid? But instead realize, okay, people responded differently. What were the historical conditions and social conditions present that made their reaction made sense? Because I think humans, for the most part, react in a sensible way to their circumstances, but people's circumstances can be so wildly different from us today that we have to dig in and make sense of that. And the Crusades is a wonderful example of, I think, how we misunderstand it. And but yeah, that's a small slice of what I try to do.
And you are or were a professor who taught Middle Eastern studies?
Yeah, my focus is on the Ottoman Empire. My main area is in the 1800s and early 1900s, but I've taught a survey course on history of Christian-Muslim relations and one course in Istanbul to a mix of Christian and Muslim students, which made it very interesting, and then a religious studies course on Islam as well. So the Crusades comes up quite a bit. It's a big touchstone on Christian-Muslim relations.
Well, I think you're the perfect guest then to have on to discuss this movie.
I'll do my best. We'll see.
Now, let's just take the bird's eye view of the Crusades. This is what this movie is predominantly about, is about the Crusades. What were the Crusades?
Yeah, so the Crusades are interesting. I would say they're one of the most remarkable events in history. So first, I'll just give a little nugget of what they were and then some context of what caused them to happen, because I don't think they could have happened at much of any other time in history due to some unique developments. Okay, so what happens is all over Europe, over 100,000 people of multiple nationalities, and this is in a Europe that probably doesn't have more than about 30 million people or so, they spontaneously decide to leave their homes, they leave their families, they walk about 5,000 kilometers, or about 3,000 miles, they go through mountains, they go through deserts, they fight a war of which few of them return. This is the first crusade I'm talking about in 1099. So later crusades are organized by governments, they're organized by churches, and they're better planned, and they go by sea instead of walking. But what happens is that in 1099 or in 1095, there is a call to reclaim the Holy Land. The First Crusade is a battle to reclaim the city of Jerusalem from the current Muslim occupiers. It succeeds. For about a century, Jerusalem is held in European hands, and then there's other small crusader kingdoms, Kingdom of Edessa, Kingdom of Tripoli, Kingdom of Antioch. They gradually fall. Jerusalem is then lost, and then there's tiny little principalities that are finally lost in 1291. So it's an attempt by Europeans to battle to reclaim the Holy Land, and then it's eventually lost. Okay, So that's the flyover view, and then I can drill more into what happened, or why did it happen? Why did a crusader go on the crusade, and why did a pope call for one, if you'd like?
Yeah, so we're still talking right now the mindset of 1099. Why would somebody go to like you said, 3,000 miles away, 5,000 kilometers? So basically, like going to the other side of the moon for them. Why would people do that, especially at this particular time in history?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and we'll get in later about misconceptions of the Crusades, because perceptions of the Crusades are almost as important of a history as the Crusades themselves, because each generation reinterprets it. And I think they reinterpret it in their own image. But okay, so let's back up. The reason that Crusaders went on crusades, as much as it might not make sense to a modern person today, but a lot of scholars of the Crusades, like Jonathan Riley Smith of Cambridge, who's, I would say, the foremost historian of the Crusades, is for religious fervor. They went out of religious conviction the way that a Muslim would go to Mecca or Medina today. Here's some background of what's happening right up before the Crusades. In about 950, the Seljuk tribe of Turkish nomads cross from Central Asia, or they convert to Islam. They sweep across Iran, they head west, and in 1071, a leader named Alp Arslan defeats the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, and it causes them to overrun most of Anatolia and almost threaten to conquer Constantinople itself. This is in the east. This is the Byzantine Empire. The Seljuk invasion triggers a period of instability and chaos in the Middle East. It's bad for the inhabitants, of course, but it's particularly negative on Christians who were making pilgrimages in large numbers to the Holy Land, to Palestine, to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, to Nazareth. Now, here's what's interesting. Jerusalem was occupied by Muslims at this point for centuries. It was occupied in the 630s, very, very shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. People who were companions of the Prophet conquered Jerusalem. Then it changed hands to different empires, the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, and then the Seljuks eventually get control of it. But it's not so much about it being in Muslim hands that kicks off the Crusades, because that had been going on for centuries, no big surprise there. But previous Arab Muslims had no problems with Christian pilgrims coming into Jerusalem. In fact, they welcomed them because this was a huge source of revenue. If you had a wealthy knight or prince or king coming through, you would want these people to be fairly well protected. But the Turkish Seljuks, who now occupy the Holy Land, they had sort of the zeal or the fervor of recent converts to Islam, and they were much more intolerant. Pilgrims were harassed, pilgrims were persecuted, and we don't know how much of this news makes its way back to Europe, because news doesn't travel very easily at this time. But there is some sort of idea that Christians are being persecuted with attempted trips to the Holy Land. So that's one factor. The other factor is that in Constantinople, Byzantine Emperor Alexius I wasn't just a little bit threatened by people harassing his pilgrims, but the very existence of his empire is under threat. In March 1095, he sends sort of an urgent message to Pope Urban II in Rome asking for help. He probably expected that there'd be a few Italian or French mercenary warriors who would come and serve under the command of the Byzantine army to help fight. What he did not expect was about 100,000, well, I guess we could call them religious fanatics that show up at his door that really aren't under control of the Byzantine Empire to go and fight them. So the call for the Crusades really takes on a life of its own. Okay, so that's anyway, those are the conditions. Now, why did the Pope call for a crusade? What kicks off the crusade, what most historians tie it to, is a speech on November 27, 1095, where Pope Urban II gives a speech at the Council of Clermont. We don't have a transcript of what he said. We have a few accounts that are written years or maybe even decades later. But the result is the 2 centuries of warfare that kicks off what we call the Crusades. So he mentions that the Saracens that the brothers in the East are under attack, and we need to go aid their cause, and we need to liberate the city of Jerusalem. He doesn't really talk a lot about Muslims themselves. The focus is on the city. Why would he call for this? At this point, there had been a schism between East and West in Christendom in 1054. And maybe the Pope thought that this could be a possibility to tie the East and the West closer together. Also, the office of the Pope is getting a lot more powerful at this time. 200, 300 years ago, there's no way the Pope would have been powerful enough to call for a crusade. During the rise of the Carolingian Empire with Charles the Great, basically the Pope was completely under the control of the Lombards and then the Frankish kingdom. So if he would have called for a crusade, no one would have cared because the Pope didn't have much power beyond his city walls. But the office of the papacy is growing in power. Perhaps the Pope sees this as an opportunity to project more power on the East, so he's willing to call for a crusade. But what shocks him is how many people rise up and answer the call. His predecessor in the 1060s actually called for a crusade against Spanish Muslims, and there were a few hundred knights that did answer the call, but there really wasn't that much effect at all militarily on Spain. So for people who say the Crusades were just about killing Muslims, well, why go to the Holy Land to kill Muslims when you can do it in Spain? But no one really cared about that because there wasn't an interest. Okay, so that's the kind of the motivation of the Pope. So what would be the motivation of an individual crusader to go on this crusade? At this time in history, there is an enormous growth in interest in pilgrimage. Think about the Canterbury Tales, where it's really a story of people going to the shrine of Thomas Becket. Pilgrimage is becoming very important to Christian identity. There's also millenarian ideas. That means kind of an apocalyptic view of the events of the end of the world coming about. And there's different spikes in history where people have this idea of the coming of Christ is imminent. In the 1400s and 1500s, this is big. In the 1800s, this is big. This causes a bunch of utopian movements in America. Some would argue today there's a lot of belief that some Christians, their views of the nation of Israel are affected by their belief that the return of Christ is imminent. So that is another thing that causes people to believe this. And there's kind of a really big belief in holy relics as well. So a lot of it comes down to simple religious conviction that would cause them to go on to the crusade. So about 100,000 people march out. By the time the main party reaches Jerusalem in June 1099, there's only about 13,000 people left, barely 10% of those that start out. Against all odds, they capture the city, then massacre many of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants to what some would see punish them for their blasphemies against God, but then they also give many their freedom as well. So they're able to hold on to it. And then one last thing with a crusader is a crusade was regarded as an armed pilgrimage. So the word crusader wasn't what was used then. They would call themselves, I think, peregrinatii, which just means pilgrim. Crusaders took a vow similar to those taken by pilgrims. They were covered by the same laws and customs. You would receive the same spiritual benefit as a pilgrim. It's considered like an act of penance, and in return for which they received an indulgence, absolving them for the penalties of their sins. Now, that doesn't mean if you're going to hell, you got to get out of hell card or you get to spring someone from hell. That's not what that means. And Kingdom of Heaven depicts it as that, and that's not it. Long story short, an indulgence properly understood, not everyone properly understood it, but it would shorten or eliminate your time in purgatory. So that's what, but it didn't get anyone out of hell who was considered to have committed a mortal sin. So you take a vow. Some people you could kind of put off having to pay back a debt if you went on a crusade. Maybe you messed around with a farmer's daughter and wanted to get out of Dodge for a little while. That could be another reason. But that's just kind of like the general overview. And so I don't want to go in too much depth here, but I'll just stop there.
Now, the main character, Balian, he was from France, and most of these crusaders at this time were French knights. They depict in the movie as his village is just a complete dump. I mean, more or less, they're all living in hovels and lean-tos that can barely stand up. What was the economic situation in Western Europe at that time, and why does it seem... is this accurate, but why does it seem like most of the knights who were going on crusades seem to have come from France?
Yeah, that's a good point. So a point on the economy is when we get into the 1100s, and the 1200s, we're entering what scholars would call the High Middle Ages. Maybe that's a little later, 1300s, but then that gets into the Renaissance. This is entering an economic boom period for Europe. It's finally overcoming what we call the Dark Ages. Now, it used to be the Dark Ages was between 500 and 1500, and historians don't like that now because it unfairly mischaracterizes the Middle Ages as being full of superstition and ignorance. When we use the Dark Ages now, what they're talking about is a period between 500 to 1000, or maybe even more specifically, 500 to 750, where we simply don't have that much in terms of historical records about the period and we don't know what was going on. But it is true that Europe's economy collapses because you have these constant invasions. You have the barbarian invasions in the 400s. You have Viking invasions in the 800s. Finally, at about 950, 1000, these mass population movements stop. It's possible to rebuild the economic institutions of Europe. It's no longer so terribly dangerous to travel from city to city. Merchants can go from town to town. Pilgrims can go from town to town. Kingdoms are starting to be able to be built up again. Kingdoms that evolve into states are solidifying. So you have economic growth and you have more economic wealth. Now, part of the reason of why it seems like there were so many French knights, and there were, like Godfrey of Bouillon, some of the main leaders of the First Crusade, were typically French. France is one of the most populous and wealthiest places in Europe during the Middle Ages and into the High Middle Ages. The Norman conquest of 1066 was by Norman King, William the Conqueror. And there's quite a close connection between England and France. Many of the great crusaders, even those considered English kings, like Richard the Lionheart, couldn't speak English. They spoke French. So they were very French in identity. England was in some ways kind of like an outpost of France at this period. So they projected the wealth. Feudalism, as we understand it, was perhaps at its most sophisticated expression in France. So quite simply, those who had the money to go on a crusade were mostly from France. And it was expensive to go on a crusade. Jonathan Riley Smith, who analyzed many charters and legal documents of crusaders when they would sell off property and goods to fund it, he estimated it'd take the average crusader about 7 years worth of wages. They had to liquidate all sorts of assets because it's not just you on your horse. You'd have your war horse, and you don't travel on that thing because it's uncomfortable. You have your riding horse. You have maybe 2 or 3 remounts. You have your war horse. You have your cook. You'd have a servant. If you're really wealthy, you might have a chronicler. You could bring your family. It was expensive. So that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of French people going out there.
Now we're starting to dig into these reasons why people went into crusades. But as you said in the introduction, the lens that later scholars have used to look at the crusades has sort of changed along the way. One of the first reasons that a lot of scholars say that crusaders went to the Holy Land was as a sort of colonialization, where second sons would go to make their way in the world. And that's actually, I think they said that almost verbatim in the movie. Is there an accuracy to that? You said that it wasn't really a really highly successful way to make money when you have to basically sell all of your assets to go to the Holy Land. Was there any economic motivation for a lord in, say, central France to go to Jerusalem?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up. When I said earlier that the Crusades seem to be reinterpreted for every generation, Kingdom of Heaven is a perfect example, because there's one point where Orlando Bloom is giving a speech that when he's trying to rally the troops to defend Jerusalem, he shouts, "This city, it's Jewish temples that Romans built upon, that Christians then built upon for their churches, that Muslims built upon for their mosques. So no religion has a claim to this city." And I think you're a medieval knight and you're going to rally your troops with a speech on 21st century multiculturalism. That's just like this is one of the worst examples I can think of, where an earnest screenwriter thinks, oh, people were so intolerant in the past. I wish I could go back and teach them the message of tolerance. I know, I'll project myself through time travel into this protagonist. And so, I mean, I know they meant well, but it's one of like the worst examples of presentism, where you're taking contemporary values in the past. And I know you have to do that to some level because you have to make a protagonist relatable and likable for a modern audience. With the second son theory, how does that make sense? Where does this come from? And would we actually see this? I'll mention a little bit more about the motivation and talk about this idea. You wouldn't be motivated by greed to go on a crusade. The second son theory is that the first son has the lion's share of property and inheritance when he goes off. And second son theory does make sense in certain contexts. A lot of the travelers in the age of navigation, the age of exploration in Europe in the 1500s, 1600s are second sons who are freebooters. Maybe they'll seek their fortune elsewhere because they won't get their family's estate. The older brother will. But crusading wouldn't be a good way to do that. It's expensive. Many people had to sell their lands, take out loans from moneylenders, Jewish moneylenders, or rely on family support. They're going for the ideas of pilgrimage, which is firmly entrenched in Christian doctrine, and rich and poor go on this, the wealthy just travel in more style. And it's seen as an act of penance because the hardships and expensive travel were seen as a way that someone could earn absolution from their sins. Now, this idea of the second son theory, I think it goes back to the Enlightenment period around the 1700s or 1800s. This is where you see historians writing about the Crusades. You'll have French universal histories. And the 1800s is where you see a major backlash against the Crusades. Enlightenment writers see the Middle Ages as superstition, the iron-fisted control of the church that destroys the free thought and expression that existed during the Roman Empire. And only in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment are we getting back. And were it not for the Middle Ages, we would be 1,000 years ahead of where we are now. So they'll come with some theories that might be based on one or two individuals and then projected over all the Crusades. You can kind of see you can see a couple of examples of landless sons heading out to carve out territories of their own. For example, Bohemond and Tancred, who are leaders on the First Crusade, who are Normans, these do spring to mind. Bohemond, I think, takes control of Antioch. So you do see a couple of examples like this, but most of the Crusaders didn't go east to settle on land at all. In fact, the ultimate failure of the Crusades, and the Crusader states were referred to as Outremer, or across the sea, the reason it failed was because people didn't settle on the lands. They didn't consolidate it. The overwhelming majority of Crusaders, they serve their time in Outremer and then they go home. The Crusader states were really from the beginning to the end, they were short on military manpower and collapsed as a result of this. And that's because the quote unquote landless second, third, and fourth sons was a myth and they didn't settle in these areas. One of the reasons that the Crusades were able to succeed as long as they could, despite being critically short on manpower, is that the one thing medieval Europe does better than probably anyone anywhere else on Earth, and even China, is fortifications, military fortifications. Europe is just covered with castles and forts, and engineers are brilliant at building fortifications, knowing how to blow up enemy fortifications. And with these fortifications, it's possible to control areas of land with much smaller numbers than you could otherwise. And in Kingdom of Heaven, they show the siege battle with Saladin against Jerusalem. And I think this is where Ridley Scott gets Lord of the Rings envy and tries to have his own Battle of Gondor there. But that is a point that in terms of siege engineering and the battle to take Jerusalem originally in the First Crusade is by some brilliant siege maneuver of these Crusaders. The place where the Crusaders run into trouble is when they're traveling between cities, and Turkish archers who are brilliant on horseback and horseback mounted archers are constantly picking them off. So there's not money to be made as a second son. Where that theory came from, like I said, these Enlightenment scholars who aren't doing a critical analysis of history. They're not going through thousands of documents and trying to rebuild economic models of crusading. They're just looking at some old chronicles in Latin and they're riffing on them, and they're just writing extemporaneously about their thoughts on it and just filling in the blank areas with their own thoughts and impressions. Now, in the 1830s and the 1850s, in the Romantic period, then you get Sir Walter Scott, who's writing about these heroic, noble, chivalrous exploits of the Crusaders, and that's where you get more of the flowery imagery that we see today.
So this movie takes place in about the 1180s. So about 80-ish years later, a couple of generations down the line. What was the context? What was going on in the Crusades and in the Holy Land in this next generation or two after the initial call to crusade?
Yeah, so that is something that I think the movie does get pretty well, and that's all the infighting that's happening during this time period. It's not Christians versus Muslims, paints over a lot of the nuance that's taking place. So what's happening in the 1180s is one of the main characters, Saladin, whatever. He is the leader of a new state, the Ayyubid state, that is taking power in Egypt, in Syria, and consolidating a lot of power in the remains of these old empires. Now, one of the reasons that the First Crusade succeeded was due to fighting between the Seljuk Turks and the Fatimids, which are a Shiite group based in Egypt. The Seljuks had controlled Jerusalem. The Fatimids were trying to take it back. As the Crusaders are marching down to Jerusalem, Fatimids are actually sending them embassies. They're giving them food and aid to support the Crusaders to try to take this city. Right before the Crusaders arrive in Jerusalem, the Egyptian Fatimids actually take it back from the Turks, and they send messengers and envoys to the Crusaders saying, guys, you don't have to come. We got the city. We kicked out those Turks. And it's not like they don't completely realize that the Crusaders aren't terribly interested in who controls the city. And I don't think they're terribly interested that it's Muslims. It's if it had been Jews or Buddhists who had controlled the city and harassed pilgrims, they probably would have fought it on equal measure as far as I understand. But because of this infighting, the Fatimids hadn't really been able to consolidate their hold and control over the city. That's what gives the Crusaders a critical advantage. What happens with Saladin is that the infighting amongst different Muslim powers in the Middle East ceases. He's able to consolidate control. He's able to raise up a very large army. And in the movie, you see Orlando Bloom's character, Balian, enter. There is a king, Baldwin IV, who had leprosy, which he did, and he went into combat with leprosy. Very fascinating figure. He's on his deathbed, and there's questions of royal succession. His son, Baldwin V, will take over, or not his son, but his nephew, and then it finds out that he has leprosy. He ends up getting killed, and then another figure becomes king. So I don't want to get into all those details because it gets confusing, but what that does accurately illustrate is the dynastic infighting and the political intrigue that is happening at this time. It's sort of a reverse of what was happening to different Muslim states in the 1090s. And this is a classic feature, of course, of European monarchical politics, of different relatives trying to claim by divine right that they have access to the throne. And this therefore gives them right. Maybe they are killed, maybe they die of natural causes, and another relative tries to claim the throne in their place. This is, broadly speaking, the context of what's happening prior to the rise of Saladin. And this is after the Second Crusade. The First Crusade is to take Jerusalem. The Second Crusade in the 1120s, 1130s is when a couple of the outlying smaller kingdoms of Edessa fall, and there's attempts to reclaim them because Europeans see these as rightfully held by Christendom. That fails. Then this movie is between the Second and Third Crusade. Jerusalem surrenders to Saladin. He retakes Jerusalem. And the Third Crusade is Richard the Lionheart and these other figures. This is called the King's Crusade, an attempt to go back and retake Jerusalem. So that's what's happening there.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. The movie, I felt, as much time as they spent on Saladin, they sort of glossed over what was going on the Muslim side of politics. They sort of portray them as one solid block. But as you were saying, there was Seljuk Turks that nobody was particularly happy with the way they were dealing in Jerusalem. What was the relationship between Saladin, who was not a Turk himself, and the Seljuk Turks and some of the other factions within the Muslim community in the Holy Land at that point?
Yeah, good question. Saladin is from Tikrit, the same city as Saddam Hussein. Ethnically, he is Kurdish. So Kurdish nationalists today celebrate Saladin as their hero. Back at that time, your ethnic identity wouldn't matter as much. The nature of an empire is you have people from different cultures, different backgrounds coming together because you have to, not because of tolerance. And this is a point in the movie where Orlando Bloom's father, played by Liam Neeson, he's celebrated as this tolerant person who embraces all religions. And when Saladin retakes Jerusalem, spoiler alert, I guess, 1,000-year-old spoiler alert, he looks at a crucifix, he places it upright, he kind of has this look of benevolence and tolerance about him as he goes about the city. And this is something everyone gets wrong about empires. When people look at the past, they imagine that, oh, if I were a Christian or a Muslim, I would support my brethren and then try to kill the other religion. Wait, look at the Mongols. They allowed other religions to live. Look at Saladin. He allowed Christians to live. Look at this Christian leader. He allowed Muslim safe passage. And I think, what else would they have done? I mean, empires were always hard to hold together, and it was almost always pragmatism, that you simply had to allow these other religious groups to exist because your state would fall apart otherwise, and it wasn't in your interest to control the beliefs of your people, and you didn't have the resources. When everything is done on horseback, when you don't have modern communication, when you don't have public schools to influence what people think as they're being taught, there's no way to influence the thoughts and beliefs on other people. So there's all these theses like the Mongols were tolerant because they allowed religions to coexist, but there simply was no other way to operate. And in fact, periods in history where you're trying to force beliefs on another person stand out because in some ways they're so exceptional. So, for example, the Spanish Inquisition in 1492, it was a horrific event, of course. I mean, it's horrific that people were forced sort of at the, burning at the stake to renounce their beliefs or to be expelled. That ignores that for 700 years, the Muslim states there in Spain were fighting a war of attrition. Spanish rulers are taking over the Iberian Peninsula piece by piece. There are many Muslim subjects under Christian rule, and there are laws where they have a place carved out for them, not so much due to Spanish benevolence, but because there was no practical way to force someone to change their religion, and you figure, well, the best I can do is tax them and then live and let live. And that's what, since really the beginning of Islam, how they dealt with Christian and Jewish subjects. Tax them and then live and let live, because we do not have the manpower and resources to do otherwise. And so anyway, on the Muslim side, that's a factor. And I'll mention one other thing too. This really astounded me because my research focus was on Turkish intellectuals in the 1800s and their engagement with the West and modernity. The Muslim world, until only in the last 100 years, did not care about the Crusades. If you were a scholar, you wouldn't know that the Crusades ever happened. The first book in Arabic, I think, is like 1899 about the Crusades. And it only becomes a big deal in the Muslim world because of colonialism. Europeans are talking about colonialism and taking over parts of the Middle East like, oh, we are the Crusaders and we have returned. And then Arab intellectuals in the 1900s sort of respond in kind that we will take up the cause of Saladin and kick you out as he did before. But throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the 1500s, into the 1800s, there's no knowledge of the Crusades because why would you care? This tiny, tiny, tiny little kingdom was held for a couple of hundred years. Then the Europeans lose and then they go home. I mean, what really stuck out were the Mongol invasions. The Mongols kill 40 million people. They destroy Baghdad, so fundamentally re-alter the map of the Middle East that is the most cataclysmic event there. You wouldn't care about the Crusades. And the earliest writings of the Crusades I've seen in the 1800s in Turkish are translations from French. And the Enlightenment kind of snubbing of the Middle Ages, they're taking this Enlightenment rhetoric from France and using it against the Crusades. So the idea that this is the linchpin that's permanently altered Christian-Muslim relations, it's really an argument about colonialism today. And the Crusades are just used as a stand-in, but no one cared about the Crusades until recent period in the past. And when Kaiser Wilhelm goes to Damascus, Syria, I think it's 1899, he's traveling in the Middle East after he sacks Otto von Bismarck. He wants to increase German presence in the Middle East, so he goes on a tour of goodwill. He asks people where the tomb of Saladin is. And Saladin is a beloved figure in Europe at this time. He's a legendary figure in, the stories of the Crusades as this noble, worthy opponent of Richard the Lionheart. He asks people where the tomb is, and nobody knows. Finally, he finds the tomb. It's in complete ruin, and he pays money to have the tomb rebuilt, and then he lays a wreath at the tomb that says, "From one great leader to another." So Saladin, the great hero, the great reconqueror of Jerusalem, was forgotten only until recent history in the Muslim world.
And it's interesting you bring up that recent history. Recent history has also sort of refocused what the Crusades are, and that's the war on terror and the actions that have been happening in the Middle East lately, probably with, you could probably say maybe the last several decades. How has that changed how people look at the Crusades?
Yeah, there's been some pretty ridiculous books. One that came out is called The Case for the Crusades by Rodney Stark. He's not a historian. He's I think a sociologist, so red flag right there. The post 9/11, it's a response against the colonialist theory. And I mentioned that the point of the Crusades wasn't colonization. That's kind of a post World War II, criticism. But then the response back to that is that no, it was actually good. The Crusaders they were fighting a defensive war, not an offensive war, because they'd been under attack by Islam since the rise of Islam in the 600s and 700s, and Northern Africa has taken over, Spain has taken over. There's fears in Europe that the Muslim world is going to envelop Christendom, so it's a war to strike against the heart of Islam. Now, that's equally ridiculous in its own way as this post 9/11 revisionist history and the idea of the war on terror, because the Muslim world stops expanding after the Battle of Tours in 732 in France. The Abbasids do conquer Sicily in the 8th century, but there's really no expansion at that point. The Crusaders themselves don't talk about the fear of Europe being overrun by Islam. There's no mention of this idea anywhere. And again, if you're worried about the Islamic world, why not go to Spain instead of going all the way to the Holy Land, where it's much more difficult to fight at that level? So it's another kind of projection into the past. It's sort of like saying that, well, why did the invasion of Normandy happen? It's revenge from, against William the Conqueror, who went from Norman France to England. So England is taking revenge. Like, those two things have nothing to do with each other. They're spread apart by centuries and centuries and centuries. And the idea that there's this institutional memory in Europe, we remember when you attacked Spain in the 700s, so we're fighting back. And that's not something that would, and if you're going to fight back against the Muslim world, why would you go to Jerusalem? The spiritual center of Islam is Mecca and Medina, of course. The intellectual center is Baghdad. The political center, I guess, would be Egypt. But Jerusalem, of course, it's an important city in Islam, but it's maybe the third most important. It's not the top dog the way it would be in Christendom. So Islam versus Christendom, like whether you think Christianity is at fault or Islam is at fault, I think both perspectives miss the point.
Now, it's interesting in the movie for the director's cut, which was almost 3.5 hours long.
Yeah.
They didn't go very deeply into any of the characters, really. I mean, a lot of the movie was just Alien, played by Orlando Bloom, looking at the female lead, and that was about it. But they kind of skimmed over and they completely cut out the Greeks, who, like you said, the Greeks were the ones who had called for the Pope to give them a little bit of help. And a lot of these leaders were married into the Byzantine royal family. How were they playing in things, especially at this point in the late 1100s?
Well, in the First Crusade, it's called by the Byzantines. The Byzantines offer aid when the Crusaders stop in Constantinople before going south to Jerusalem. Originally, it's envisioned that there'd be some Western knights that would show up. They'd aid the Byzantine army. They'd liberate Antioch. They'd liberate Jerusalem. And then the Byzantines would administer Jerusalem. And they had 400 years before. And they had only lost Antioch about 20 years before. That was the original idea, but then turns into its own thing where the Western knights are operating on their own. And then the disastrous Fourth Crusade, when Constantinople is sacked by Western knights in 1204 and controlled by Latin crusaders for about 60 years, permanently leads to enmity between the two sides. So there's not the Byzantine military presence in the Holy Land, but there are a lot of Christians in Jerusalem. I think about half the city or so might have been Christian, of the Orthodox variety or Nestorian variety in Jerusalem. And this is what leads to, I don't know if I'd say a hybrid culture, but intercultural mingling where you do have some Latin knights marrying locals, and that's almost invariably Orthodox Christians in that land. So this is something where it's not just like these outsider Europeans and turbaned Arabs like the movie makes it seem to be, but there is this interesting hybrid culture as well that slowly starts to develop. Although the intermingling, as far as I understand, in the Middle East, it's not like Muslim Andalus Spain, where there's very porous boundaries between Muslim and Christian and Jew, and they commonly speak a similar language with one another when no Arabic. There's less of an intermingling because a lot of the Crusaders are in heavily garrisoned cities, or if they are a baron who has some of their own land. That can happen, but there's a lot of people being in fortifications. It's kind of like with the early spread of Islam. Many of the soldiers live outside of the cities in heavily garrisoned forts. So that's why the Arab culture and Arab language is still maintained, and you don't see soldiers there start to speak Coptic or Syriac or whatever. There's something sort of similar in the Crusades where, because of garrison fortress defense, that doesn't lead to this maybe massive cross-pollination like you would see. Although, of course, there are influences that the Crusades do have on Europe.
That's interesting you bring that up, because at this point, there's a lot of those Crusader leaders who were born in the Middle East. They've traveled back to Europe very infrequently, and they did show the princess Sibylla.
Yeah.
She was wearing henna all the time and dressed in a very, I guess you might say, like archetypal Middle Eastern fashion. Did fashions and that sort of thing, did the Crusaders who were basically born in the Middle East, did they at least take on some of those aspects of the culture, or did they stay more in line with European fashion and European modes of culture?
Oh, well, this is an aside, and I think you might know more about this as a movie buff than me, but when I was taking notes on the movie and looking at Eva Green's character, as an aside, hands down, best Bond girl ever. But I thought to myself, is this during Ridley Scott's kind of like creative bankrupt period? Because I feel like he's kind of desperately trying to ape off of Lord of the Rings, where when the knights are charging into combat, you hear this mournful Middle Eastern music, but then I hear things, I think, this sounds like the Elvish singing when the Knights of Rohan are charging into battle. And Eva Green, is she trying to be Arwen, basically, this, really sort of porcelain-like figure who's in the background? And I wrote down, if this movie were made in 2012, Eva Green would have been a cheap knockoff of Scarlett Johansson's Black Widow and know all sorts of martial arts and combat. So I don't know if you're had any sense there of...
Yeah.
Now, there is some impact on culture of Europe at this time. So some have theorized that the use of rosary beads by Catholics comes from the use of prayer beads that Muslims would have in their hands to recount the names of God, a possible Muslim influence, or that the hygienic practices of Muslims as they're doing ablutions before times of prayer could have influenced hygiene standards back in Europe. I think that's a little bit more off because hygiene was something that was taken seriously in the Middle Ages. We don't consider that, but more so than I think perhaps we give it credit. Areas where we can see influence back on Europe is that Crusaders who came back from the Middle East to Europe were celebrities, and cathedrals and churches in Europe are full of reliquaries, of relics, of holy relics that are claimed to have come from the Holy Land. Of here's the hip bone of the donkey that brought Jesus into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Here's a piece of the true cross. Oh yeah, you got to have a piece of the true cross. A lot of those so-called relics came from the Crusades, and some have theorized that this veneration of relics that's already happening gets supercharged by the encounters with Orthodox Christians and their venerations of icons. Yes, there are icons in Catholicism, but in Orthodoxy, perhaps even more so. So that can be cranked up a notch. Now, there is interest as well. Something that does cause more influence in Europe is with more people coming and going between the Middle East. You have these Crusader outposts on the coast of the Levant, which is now in Jordan, Lebanon, those areas. these shippers and these merchants are ferrying troops, they're ferrying nobles back and forth, and now they're engaging in trade. And this lays the groundwork for great Italian city-states of the late Renaissance, of Venice and Genoa and other places to further stretch out their trading empire. You have Venetian or Genoan outposts being built in Constantinople in the 1200s and the 1300s, and eventually stretches up all the way into the Black Sea. Now, the Mongols in the 1200s are, I would argue, more influential because they really consolidate and open up the Silk Road, and Marco Polo goes out east and all that. But the first kind of step of trade going into the Middle East by Europe is through the Crusades, because now you have a highway going back and forth between this area, between the coasts of Lebanon and Jordan, and back into Europe.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Now, the last big event in this movie, and it marked sort of an end in the Crusades, or a transition point, is the Battle of Hattin. And the character of Balian, he basically lays out before they go into the battle the reason why they're going to lose, that there's not enough water. And so they do lose. Could you maybe summarize that battle for us and what it meant for the Crusades?
Okay, well, sadly, I don't know the details of how the battle went down. So Balian is there. He does surrender the city to Saladin. A couple of factors there that I will mention, maybe more on kind of like the ethos of the battle, how it's portrayed in the movie versus reality, and then the character of Saladin itself. Now, like I was saying earlier, Orlando Bloom gives a speech calling for multiculturalism, and then he finds a bunch of peasants and he knights them, saying that they'll be more vigorous in battle that way. It's like he wants to obliterate kind of like class in the Middle Ages as well, which again, like you...
Yeah, he really got everything in there.
But another thing I wrote down in my notes is I expected him, Orlando Bloom, to go to Saladin saying, "To show you I respect your beliefs, I will convert to Islam." And then Saladin says, "No, to show you I respect you, I will convert to Christianity." And then they go arm in arm and start singing John Lennon's Imagine There's No Religions. It's easy if you try. So you're not going to rouse troops with a speech of multiculturalism. He also says, another point he makes is that he'll fight to the death of the city to kind of break Saladin because he wants to protect the inhabitants. And Saladin says, "Well, I will promise safe passage for everybody if you surrender the city." And Orlando Bloom accepts these terms. And the people are granted safe passage by Saladin. However, many are ransomed. They're not just given passage for free. This is what historically happens. And those who couldn't be ransomed were sold into slavery, which that was customary practice there. So I don't want to knock Saladin for that. He is perhaps a little bit better than most people this time, but yeah, he wasn't. There's been a lot of embellishment on his chivalrous nature, mostly done by Europeans, but that might be an embellishment there. But anyway, back to Orlando Bloom's point. I'm just calling him that instead of Balian, whatever. We don't need to defend this city because the true Jerusalem is in our hearts. Well, I mean, the point of the Crusades was to take Jerusalem because in the 21st century, we consider this as like a war on terror or a colonization. We want to control this physical geography for grabbing more power. That's a colonist view of things of the 1800s, of looking at things in terms of economics. From a Crusader's perspective, getting Jerusalem wasn't just about a second son getting wealth or property or commerce or whatever. From a pilgrim's perspective, there was a spiritual nature to the city of Jerusalem itself. This is why a pilgrim would care so much about a holy relic or an icon, that this physical item is suffused with the grace of the Lord. The same way when I take the Eucharist, this bread has been transubstantiated into a physical item that now has an otherworldly element to it. And that was the understanding of Jerusalem to a pilgrim or to a crusader. Were there cynical people who were using that language to fight for their own gain? Of course there were. That's true of any war. There's war profiteering in anything you can see going back to ancient history. But if we take people at their word and we just look economically why people fought in a crusade, that it was a money-losing venture, for better or for worse, they really did believe that there was spiritual significance to Jerusalem. And I don't think we have to stretch too far to see this, because would a Muslim assign spiritual significance to Mecca and Medina? I would argue, yes, they would. And if they were fighting a battle and their city were to be taken, would they say, well, the true Mecca and Medina is in our hearts, and just walk out easily? I don't think so. Now, again, not excusing the Crusades, don't think they were great, but just to understand it on the terms of the people there, the nature of what he's calling for doesn't make a lot of sense. And in terms of the specific battle tactics there's at one point this domino effect used on the different siege towers. That wouldn't be plausible in the pitch of battle, because of doing things with that level of precision just isn't quite that feasible. So that's where I would describe the nature of the battle. If we talk about the motivations of the soldiers, we need to see things from the perspective of the Crusaders themselves. And that's where I think this movie really misses it. That it came out in 2005. It's very clearly an allegory for the War on Terror. And it's when Orlando Bloom is talking to Saladin, and Saladin says, maybe it's better if the city is destroyed. He's arguing that the city has caused so much bloodshed and conflict that we're better that it didn't exist. And that's a very modern interpretation of why they're of this event. But for people on the ground, they would clearly see a holy site worth fighting for and worth dying for. So, yeah, I guess I'd say that any historical movie, you're going to have presentism. It can't be a Discovery Channel documentary, and I get that. I don't want to be too much of a nitpicky nerd, but when we don't at least try a little bit to understand people on their own terms, and instead just inject our values, and the protagonist is basically us in the past, and the villains are the people we consider the bad people today, the xenophobes, the bigots, and that's them in the past, then we lose what history can teach us about those who came before us and who wrestled with the same issues of human nature that we have. And of course, they made plenty of mistakes. We want to learn from them. But I think they're historical figures that, if we look, can teach us interesting things as well. But if we gloss over it with all this presentism and injecting our own values, then we lose those things.
The next stage of the movie, and this is where it leads off, is with Richard the Lionhearted. And we know that later he's the one who leads the Third Crusade. Now, here is your chance to be a nitpicky nerd. What's your final takeaway? And if you could add something to this movie to maybe make it a little bit more accurate or more portrayal of the time, what do you think you might add to it?
Well, I guess I don't know why they don't have Richard the Lionheart going to fight Saladin. That's what everyone knows about with the Crusade. And this movie is, I think, obviously trying to do a revisionist take. Like, this is the Crusades you didn't know about. And every movie tries to do that these days. There was a recent one with King Arthur. I forget what it's called, that came out this year.
I think it was Excalibur or just King Arthur.
And I talked to a King Arthur historian, and she calls it Excalibro, the Guy Ritchie one, where he's this rough guy. He might as well be from Cockney, speak with a Cockney accent and gets in brawls. And like, if you're going to pretend to be like the true history and you still mess it up, then why not just that's why I respect Pirates of the Caribbean almost more. It doesn't it's obviously not trying to be accurate, even though in some ways it's more than this movie. But here's why I think Richard the Lionheart is so good. Now, he is probably the towering figure of the Crusader folklore, and he fights with Saladin, and these are portrayed as like the two pinnacles of chivalry on the Christian side and on the Muslim side. And part of the reason that Saladin is built up so much is because perhaps later historians needed an explanation for, well, the Crusaders took Jerusalem by supernatural means, so maybe they also lost it by supernatural means in such a great foe, and that the two are fighting one another. And following the 1192 Treaty of Ramla, Jerusalem remains under Muslim control, but it remains open to Christian pilgrims. So Saladin promises free access of Christian pilgrims back to the city, sort of returning to the status quo of what was happening way before before the Crusades anyway. And according to one account, Richard and Saladin converse through messengers. They pay proper respects to each other through chivalrous acts. Saladin sends his physician to Richard when he hears that he's sick and all these different things. Now, here's where I think a historical account is useful. Richard is portrayed as the great king of England that when he's off fighting the Crusades, his brother John takes over. He's hopelessly corrupt, so Robin Hood has to step up to right the wrongs. And then Richard returns from the Crusade as this great hero. Richard was a terrible king. He basically bankrupted England. He said he would sell the whole island if he could to fund his expedition there. He fights for a few years, but then has to return back to France because he's more French than he is English. He doesn't speak English. He speaks French. And I think he accidentally gets shot by an arrow. There's different arguments about the causes of his death. But yeah, he wrecks England's economy. Part of the Robin Hood story can be seen as the island is in turmoil because different people are jockeying for power in his absence. So in this vacuum of lawlessness, this vigilante has to rise up. So it's like Afghanistan, where different warlords are clamoring for power. So like the Robin Hood myth is the absolute most wonderful spin on events you could possibly take. The reason we think he's so great is when you're rich, like Richard, you have chroniclers. You have people who are paid to talk about how awesome you are. They write rich, voluminous accounts about your great, heroic, noble deeds. These get passed down and translated. And when there's really no other alternate account to challenge you, that is what is going to take root in the narrative. So having Richard show up, showing him that he's a very wealthy leader, he needs a translator to talk to other English kings, and then maybe Saladin as well, showing him that he's a great military strategist, but he's also a power broker trying to put together this extremely messy patchwork of alliances in the Muslim world. And then once the Crusaders leave, it just falls back into the same warfare it had before, showing how the two sides they have just as much conflict trying to keep together their own alliance as they do fighting each other. I think that would be a great story. I'd watch that movie about the Crusades.
Yeah, I think they could have made a movie about Richard. I mean, if they really wanted to just go in the same vein as they did for the Kingdom of Heaven of Richard and Saladin having a bromance. And I mean, they could have done that. And that probably would have been a more interesting movie having, clear main characters.
Yeah. And movies are tricky because I think with something like a Netflix miniseries, you have the convenience of time to actually enter into the world. Like the John Adams miniseries, or that's not Netflix, but they've had a lot of these historical dramas. You can actually ease into the world, or even like Mad Men, where you get into the 1960s. A movie is only 2 hours or 3 hours, and you don't have the luxury of time, so you have to be a little bit more starker. But crafted well, I think you can still make something accessible to a modern audience while showing them the novelty of this foreign world and how these people are different, but the way they try to challenge the audience and say, okay, you placed in this situation, would you have really acted any differently? Rather than, hey, why don't you have some wish fulfillment fantasy that if you went back in time, you would make it right? I haven't seen this movie, but The Help, the Emma Stone movie that came out a few years ago, where basically the Southern woman single-handedly ends racism in the South in the Jim Crow era. It's like, I don't know, it's modern day wish fulfillment of, man, if I had been back in the 50s and 60s, I would have been with the Freedom Riders. I would have been the good person to not be racist. But a good challenging movie is, well, would you? I mean, it was dangerous to be against racism in that time. So bully for you if you would have done it, but understand the risks of that. So I think that's what good historical drama does.
Thank you again for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. I really want to thank our guest, Scott Rank of the History Unplugged podcast, for joining us today. Links to learn more about Professor Rank and his projects can be found at his website, historyonthenet.com, or in the show notes. If you want to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, subscribe, download, find out links on how to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or email me, you can always go to the website a2zhistorypage.com. My email is steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I definitely love to hear if you have any ideas for future show topics and anything else, comments, questions, or just to have a conversation. Links to all that and more can be found in the show notes. Thanks again for joining us, and I will see you next time beyond the big screen.